Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Religion. Natural religion. The spirit that knows spirit is consciousness of itself and is present to itself in objective form. It is, and is at the same time being that is for itself. It is for itself. It is the aspect of self-consciousness, and that too in contrast to the aspect of its consciousness, or of the relating of itself to itself as object. In its consciousness, there is antithesis, and in consequence, the specific character of the shape in which it appears to itself and knows itself. It is solely with this that we are concerned in this treatment of religion, for we have already considered its unembodied essence, or its pure notion. But at the same time, the difference of consciousness and self-consciousness falls within the latter. The shape of religion contains not the existence of spirit as nature that is free from thought, nor as a thought that is free from existence, but it is an existence that is preserved in thinking, and also something thought that is objectively present to it. It is in accordance with the specific character of this shape, in which spirit knows itself, that one religion is distinguished from another. But we have at the same time to note that the exposition of this knowledge of itself within the framework of this single specific character does not in fact exhaust the totality of an actual religion. The series of different religions which will come into view just as much sets forth again only the different aspects of a single religion, and moreover of every single religion, and the ideas which seem to distinguish one actual religion from another occur in each one. At the same time, however, the difference must also be viewed as a difference of religion, for since spirit lives in the difference of its consciousness and its self-consciousness, the aim of the movement is to supersede this cardinal distinction and to give the form of self-consciousness to the shape that is the object of consciousness. But this difference is not superseded simply by the fact that the shapes contained by self-consciousness have within them the moment of self, and that God is thought of as self-consciousness. The self that is thought of is not the actual self, in order that the self, like any other more precise determination of shape, may in truth belong to this shape. It must, on the one hand, be posited in the shape by the act of self-consciousness, and on the other hand, the lower determination must show itself to be reduced to a moment of the higher and to be comprehended by it, for what is thought of ceases to be something merely thought of, something alien to the self's knowledge, only when the self has produced it, and therefore beholds the determination of the object as its own, consequently beholds itself in the object. Through the activity, the lower determination has at the same time vanished. For the act is the negative that is realized at the expense of something else. Insofar as the lower determination is still present, it has retreated into an unessential aspect, just as on the other hand, where the lower is still dominant, but the higher is also present, the one determination, devoid of itself, has its place alongside the other. The truth of the belief in a determination of the religious spirit is revealed in the fact that the constitution of the actual spirit is similar to that of the shape in which spirit beholds itself in the religion, as, for example, the incarnation of God, which occurs in Oriental religion, has no truth, because the actual spirit of that religion is without its reconciliation. It is inappropriate here to return from the totality of determinations to the individual ones, and to show in which shape, within the totality and its particular religion, the others are contained in their completeness. The higher form, being placed under a lower, has lost its significance, for self-consciousness belongs to it only superficially and to its picture thought. It is to be considered in its proper significance only where it is the principle of this particular religion and is upheld by its actual spirit. God as light. Spirit as the essence, that is self-consciousness, or the self-conscious being that is all truth and knows all reality as its own self, is to begin with only its notion in contrast to the actuality which it gives itself in the movement of its consciousness, and this notion is as contrasted with the daylight of this explicit development, the night of its essence, as contrasted with the outer existence of its moments as independent shapes. It is the creative secret of its birth. This secret has its revelation within itself, for the existence of its moments has its necessity in this notion, because this notion is self-knowing spirit and therefore has in its essence the moment of being self-consciousness and of presenting itself objectively. This is the pure I, which in its externalization has within itself as universal object the certainty of its own self, or, in other words, this object is for the I the penetration of all thought and all reality. In the immediate first diremption of self-knowing absolute spirit, its shape has a determination which belongs to immediate consciousness or to sense certainty. Spirit beholds itself in the form of being, though not of the non-spiritual being that is filled with the contingent determinations of sensation. The being that belongs to sense certainty, on the contrary, it is being that is filled with spirit. It also includes the form which appeared in immediate self-consciousness, the form of Lord and Master over against the self-consciousness that retreats from its object. This being which is filled with the notion of spirit is, then, the shape of the simple relation of spirit to itself, or the shape of shapelessness. In virtue of this determination, this shape is the pure, all-embracing and all-pervading essential light of sunrise, which preserves itself in the formless substantiality. Its otherness is the equally simple and negative darkness, the movements of its own externalization, its creations in the unresisting element of its otherness, are torrents of light in their simplicity. They are at the same time the genesis of its being for self, and the return from the existence of its moments, streams of fire destructive of all structured form. The moment of difference which it gives itself does, it is true, proliferate unchecked in the substance of existence, and shapes itself to the form of nature. Yet the essential simplicity of its thought moves aimlessly about in it without stability or intelligence, enlarges its bounds to the measureless, and its beauty, heightened to splendor, is dissolved in its sublimity. The content developed by this pure being, or the activity of its perceiving, is therefore an essenceless byplay in the substance which merely ascends without descending into the depths to become a subject and, through the self, to consolidate its distinct moments. The determinations of this substance are only attributes which do not attain to self-subsistence, but remain merely names of the many named One. The One is clothed with the manifold powers of existence and with the shapes of reality as with an adornment that lacks a self. They are merely messengers, having no will of their own, messengers of its might, visions of its glory, voices in its praise. However, this reeling, unconstrained life must determine itself as being for self and endow its vanishing shapes with an enduring subsistence. The immediate being in which it stands in antithesis to its consciousness is itself, the negative power which dissolves this distinction. It is thus in truth the self, and spirit therefore passes on to know itself in the form of self. Pure light disperses its unitary nature into an infinity of forms and offers up itself as a sacrifice to being for self, so that from its substance the individual may take an enduring existence for itself. Plant and animal. That there is a poet with his muse in the forest. Philosophers need their muses too. I have mine. Self-conscious spirit that is withdrawn into itself from the shapeless essence, or has raised its immediacy to self, in general, determines its unitary nature as the manifoldness of being for self, and is the religion of spiritual perception. In this it falls apart into the numberless multiplicity of weaker and stronger, richer and poorer spirits. This pantheism, which to begin with is the passive subsistence of these spiritual atoms, develops into a hostile movement within itself. The innocence of the flower religion, which is merely the self-less idea of self, gives place to the earnestness of warring life, to the guilt of animal religion. The passivity and impotence of contemplative individuality pass into destructive being for self. It is of no use to have taken from the things of perception the deadness of abstraction, and to have raised them to beings of spiritual perception. The ensoulment of this kingdom of spirits bears this death within it owing to the determinateness and the negativity which encroach upon the innocent indifference of plant life. Through this negativity, the dispersion into the multiplicity of passive plant forms becomes a hostile movement in which the hatred which stems from being for self is aroused. The actual self-consciousness of this dispersed spirit is a host of separate, antagonistic, national spirits who hate and fight each other to the death and become conscious of specific forms of animals as their essence, for they are nothing else than animal spirits, animal lives, which separate themselves off from one another and are unconscious of their universality. In this hatred, however, the determinateness of purely negative being for self consumes itself, and through this movement of the notion, spirit enters into another shape. Superseded being for self is the form of the object, a form produced by the self, or rather, is the produced self, the self-consuming self, that is, the self that becomes a thing. The artificer therefore retains the upper hand over these mutually destructive animal spirits, and his action is not merely negative, but tranquil and positive. Spirit's consciousness is thus now the movement which is above and beyond the immediate in itself, as it is above and beyond the abstract being for self, since the in itself is reduced through opposition to being a determinateness. It is no longer the proper form of absolute spirit, but a reality which its consciousness finds confronting it as an ordinary existent thing, and which it supersedes at the same time. This consciousness is not only the being for self, which supersedes its object, but it also produces its own idea, the being for self, that is put forth in the form of an object. This productive activity, however, is not a perfect, but a conditioned activity, the fashioning of a material already to hand. The artificer. Spirit. Therefore here appears as an artificer, and its action whereby it produces itself as object, but without having yet grasped the thought of itself, is an instinctive operation, like the building of a honeycomb by bees. The first form, because it is immediate, is the abstract form of the understanding, and the work is not yet in its own self filled with spirit. The crystals of pyramids and obelisks, simple combinations of straight lines with plane surfaces and equal proportions of parts, in which the incommensurability of the round is destroyed, these are the works of this artificer of rigid form. On account of the merely abstract intelligibleness of the form, the significance of the work is not in the work itself, is not the spiritual self. Thus either the works receive spirit into them only as an alien, departed spirit that has forsaken its living saturation with reality, and being itself dead, takes up its abode in this lifeless crystal, or they have an external relation to spirit as something which is itself there externally and not as spirit. They are related to it as to the dawning light which casts its significance on them. The division from which the artificer, spirit, starts the inner self, which becomes the material, which becomes the material it fashions, and the being for self, which is the aspect of self-consciousness at work. This division has become objective to it in its work. Its further efforts must aim at getting rid of this division of soul and body, to clothe and give shape to soul in its own self, and to endow body with soul. The two aspects, in being brought closer to each other, retain the specific character of spirit, as ideally conceived, and as its enveloping husk. Spirit's unity with itself contains this antithesis of individuality and universality, since the work in the coming together of its aspects comes closer to itself. This at the same time produces another result, namely that the work comes closer to the self-consciousness performing it, and that the latter in the work comes to know itself as it is in its truth. But in this way, the work at first constitutes only the abstract aspect of the activity of spirit, which does not yet know the content of this activity within itself, but in its work, which is a thing. The artificer himself, spirit, in its entirety, has not yet appeared, but is still the hidden, is still inner hidden, is still the, it is the still inner hidden essence, which, as an entirety, is present only as divided into the active self-consciousness and the object it has produced. The surrounding habitation, then, the outer reality which has been raised at first only into the abstract form of the understanding, is fashioned by the artificer into a more lifelike form. For this purpose he employs plant life, which is no longer sacred as it was to the earlier impotent pantheism. On the contrary, the artificer who grasps himself as the being that is for itself takes that plant life as something to be used and reduces it to an outer aspect, to a mere ornament, but it is not used unaltered, for the artificer of the self-conscious form at the same time destroys the transitoriness inherent in the immediate existence of this life and brings its organic form nearer to the more rigid and more universal forms of thought. The organic form, which left to itself, proliferates unchecked in particularity, being itself subjugated by the form of thought, in turn raises these rectilinear flat shapes into a roundness more typical of the organic forms, a blending which becomes the root of free architecture. This dwelling, the aspect of the universal element, or inorganic nature of spirit, now also includes within it a shape of individuality which brings nearer to actuality the spirit that previously was separated from existence and was external or internal to it, and thereby makes the work more in harmony with active self-consciousness. The artificer lays hold first of all of the form of being for self, in general, or the animal shape. That he is no longer conscious of himself immediately in animal life, he proves by contributing himself the productive power constituting himself, the productive power in relation to it, and knows himself in it as in his work, whereby the animal shape at the same time becomes superseded and the hieroglyph of another meaning of a thought. Consequently, the shape too is no longer solely and entirely used by the artificer, but is blended with the shape of thought with the human form, but the work still lacks the shape and outer reality in which the self exists as self. It still does not in its own self proclaim that it includes within it an inner meaning. It lacks speech, the element in which the meaning filling it is itself present. Therefore the work, even when it is wholly purged of the animal element and wears only the shape of self-consciousness, is still the soundless shape which needs the rays of the rising sun in order to have sound, which generated by light is even then merely noise and not speech, and reveals only an outer, not the inner self. Over against this outer shape of the self stands the other shape, which proclaims its possession of an inner being. Nature, withdrawing into its essence, deposes its living, self-particularizing, self-entangling manifold existence to the level of an unessential husk, which is the covering of the inner being, and this inner being is, in the first instance, still simple darkness, the unmoved, the black formless stone. The translator added this next bit for illumination: the black stone in the Kaaba at Mecca. Both representations contain inwardness and outer existence, the two moments of spirit, and both representations contain the two moments at once in an antithetical relation, the self both as inner and as outer. The two have to be united. The soul of the statue in human shape does not yet come forth from the inner being, is not yet speech, the outer existence that is in its own self inward, and the inner being of multiform existence is still soundless, is not immanently differentiated, and is still separated from its outer existence, to which all differences belong. The artificer, therefore, unites the two by blending the natural and the self-conscious shape, and this ambiguous being, which is a riddle to itself, the conscious wrestling with the non-conscious, the simple inner with the multiform outer, the darkness of thought mating with the clarity of utterance, These break out into the language of a profound but scarcely intelligible wisdom. In this work, there is an end of the instinctive effort which produced the work that, in contrast to self-consciousness, lacked consciousness. For in it, the activity of the artificer, which constitutes self-consciousness, comes face to face with an equally self-conscious, self-expressive inner being. In it, he has worked himself up to the point where his consciousness is divided against itself, where spirit meets spirit. In this unity of self-conscious spirit with itself, insofar as it is the shape and the object of its consciousness, its blendings with the unconscious shapes are purged of the immediate shapes of nature. These monsters in shape, word and deed are dissolved into spiritual shape, into an outer that has retreated into itself, and an inner that utters or expresses itself out of itself and in its own self into thought, which begets itself, which preserves its shape in harmony with itself and is a lucid, intelligible existence. Spirit is artist. While nature sleeps.